Snow drifted down the length of Main Street in small, unhurried spirals, catching in the uneven gaps between warped boards and settling like sifted flour on the rooftops. The air carried the faint tang of iron from the blacksmith's cold anvil, mingled with the brittle scent of pine from the half-frozen woodpiles stacked behind buildings. The sky had the color of tin left out in the rain, dull, enduring, and heavy, and each sound seemed to wear a muffled coat: the creak of a swinging sign, the thump of a shutter in the wind, the faint crunch of boots far off. On the edge of the boardwalk, a woman sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap. She wore a dress once burgundy but faded now to something between rust and wine, its hem dark with melting snow. Her hair was pulled back in a manner that suggested habit more than vanity, though a few damp strands had freed themselves to rest against her cheek. She didn't move often, save for the slow tightening and loosening of her fingers as if she were keeping count of moments passing. Her boots were scuffed and poorly mended, the soles whispering of miles walked without a destination. She'd been there since the hour when the saloon lamps first blinked out, when most of the town's few early risers were still stirring their coffee over embers. No one had asked her to move along, but neither had anyone asked her in. People here knew how to avoid entanglement with strangers. They did it with a precision born from their own scars. Every so often, someone would pass on their way to the mercantile or the livery, eyes skipping past her like flat stones over water. She didn't blame them. A sharp gust swept around the corner, tossing a fine spray of snow into her lap. She brushed it away absently, glancing toward the far end of the street where the buildings gave way to open land and the mountains rose in quiet dominion. She was thinking of moving on, though she had nowhere particular to go, when two small figures emerged from the whiteness. They were no more than 6 or 7, their steps quick but uncertain, as if the cold urged them forward but caution slowed them. Both wore woolen shawls too large for their narrow shoulders, the fringe dragging damply. Blonde braids framed their pale faces, the ends stiff with ice. One carried a rag doll so worn its original fabric was indistinguishable, the seams thick with repairs. The other kept her hands pressed together under her chin, as if holding in warmth or words. They stopped a few feet from her, the snow gathering on their hair and lashes. The taller of the two, the one with the doll, looked at her directly, her small mouth set in a way that was both brave and breaking. "Our mama died today," she said, voice small but steady. "Can we hug you?" The woman blinked, the words colliding with her thoughts like pebbles against glass. She hadn't expected speech, much less this. The air between them seemed to still, the snow hanging in it like suspended breath. She searched their faces, seeing the redness of eyes rubbed too much, the raw edge of loss that had no place to land. Her instinct was to tell them no, not out of cruelty, but out of the certainty that she was no harbor for grief. She was a body adrift herself, her own edges worn and fragile. But something in the way the smaller girl's fingers worried at the fringe of her shawl, and in the unblinking way the older one held her gaze, loosened the resistance she'd carried for years. Without speaking, she opened her arms slightly. It was not much of an invitation, but it was enough. They stepped forward together, their thin bodies pressing into the folds of her dress, the cold from their coats seeping into her. She smelled wood smoke in their hair, and underneath it, the faint salt of tears dried hours ago. Around them, the town went on in its muted rhythm. A man led a mule past the general store. A woman swept snow from her porch. Somewhere, a door slammed against the wind. The three of them stayed there a moment longer until the girl stepped back, their breaths coming in small puffs. "Where's your papa?" the woman asked quietly. The smaller one shook her head, a quick, sharp movement. The older's eyes flickered toward the street as if the answer might be there, then back to the woman. "Ain't got one," she said simply. The woman swallowed, her throat tight. "You should be indoors. You'll freeze." They glanced at each other the way children do when deciding whether to reveal a secret. It was the smaller one who spoke this time, her voice thin as paper. "Ain't got a place." The woman's fingers tightened in her lap. She could feel the decision pressing at her from all sides, the knowledge that if she didn't move now, someone else might, and not all kindnesses wore the same face. She rose, brushing snow from her skirts, and gestured toward the low building beside them. Inside, the air was warmer but faintly stale, the scent of old wood and coal dust lingering. The single room held a few chairs, a cold stove, and a counter where a man in a vest sat tallying figures without looking up. She led the girls to the stove, crouching to coax what little heat was left from the embers. "Sit close," she told them, and they obeyed without hesitation. She found a crust of bread in her satchel and divided it into thirds. They ate in silence, the sound of their chewing almost loud in the stillness. The older one cradled her doll in one arm, nibbling with the other hand. The smaller sat with both feet tucked under her, as if making herself smaller in the chair. "Do you have names?" the woman asked after a while. They told her, and she repeated them softly as if testing the weight of each. She didn't offer her own in return. The door opened, letting in a rush of cold air and a tall figure dusted with snow. A man stepped inside, broad-shouldered, his coat collar turned high, his hat rimmed white. He paused just inside, eyes moving over the room, and for the briefest moment they met hers. There was no judgment there, only a steady taking in of the scene. The two girls by the stove, the bread in their hands, the woman crouched between them. He gave a small nod, more to the girls than to her, before turning to the counter. He conducted his business in a low voice, bought a sack of flour, and left. She felt his presence linger in the air after the door closed, as if he had left behind something weightless but not without meaning. When the bread was gone, she pulled a quilt from a stack in the corner and wrapped it around the girls, tucking the edges in firmly. They leaned against each other, their eyes growing heavy. She sat back watching them. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. She thought of leaving again, of slipping out while they slept, but the thought tightened her chest in an unfamiliar way. The image of them waking alone in this cold room rose before her, and she could not set it aside. The stove gave a low sigh as the last ember went out. The room dimmed, the light thinning to the gray of late afternoon. She reached for the quilt, pulling it higher around their chins. One stirred, mumbling something she couldn't catch. The door opened again. It was the man from before. He carried a bundle of kindling under one arm and a small sack in the other. Without a word, he set the kindling by the stove, knelt to arrange it, and struck a match. The fire caught quickly, filling the room with the sharp scent of pine resin. He placed the sack on the table. "Potatoes," he said simply, then straightened and adjusted his hat. His eyes rested briefly on the girls, then on her. Something unspoken passed between them, not a promise but a recognition. She nodded once, unsure why her throat felt tight again. He left without waiting for thanks, the door closing softly behind him. The girls slept on, their breaths deep and even. She sat in the chair nearest the stove, letting the warmth creep into her bones. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of a horse's hooves on packed snow. She imagined the man riding away, his figure folding into the white horizon, and wondered why the thought left her unsettled. When the last light began to drain from the windows, she rose to check the latch on the door. Through the glass, she saw the street empty but for the slow drift of snow and the faint outline of boot tracks leading away. For reasons she could not name, she followed them with her eyes until they vanished into shadow. Somewhere in the stillness, she knew a choice was forming, one that would not wait long. The fire he'd built still gave off a low, steady heat by the time the girls stirred. The woman was sitting near the stove, elbows resting on her knees, staring into the small orange cradle of flame as though trying to memorize it. The boarding house room was dim but warmer than the night before. The frost that had crept along the inside of the window panes was beginning to retreat, leaving behind watery streaks. Somewhere outside, a wagon rattled past, its wheels clattering over the frozen ground, but the sound faded quickly into the stillness. The older of the two girls was the first to open her eyes. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, then sat up, clutching the quilt to her chin. The rag doll was wedged under her arm, its limp body folded in on itself as if it too had been sleeping. The younger girl remained curled up, her breath soft and even, a small lock of hair plastered against her cheek. "You stayed," the older one said quietly, almost as if she hadn't expected it. The woman glanced over, the corner of her mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Seemed wrong to leave you in the cold." The girl studied her, as though measuring whether this answer was enough. Then she nodded once, slowly, and slid off the bed. Her bare feet touched the wood floor, and she winced at the chill before padding closer to the stove. The woman stood, brushing off her skirt, and crossed to her satchel. From it, she pulled the last of the bread she had, 2 thick slices, gone stale at the edges. She cut them into smaller pieces with a small pocket knife, dividing them onto 3 chipped plates she'd found on a shelf. The bread was hard, but the girls ate as if it were a feast. The younger woke to the sound of chewing, rubbing her eyes with her fists before joining her sister at the table. They ate without chatter, the only sounds the crunch of crust and the occasional crackle from the fire. The woman took the smallest portion, not out of self-denial but because the act of giving more to the girls came without thought. She washed it down with a cup of tepid water from the pitcher on the counter. When they were finished, she collected the plates, setting them back on the shelf. "Do you have names?" she asked, turning toward them. The older answered first, her voice carrying a hint of pride. The younger followed, her tone quieter, almost shy. The woman repeated each name slowly, tasting them as though they were words from another language she wanted to remember. She didn't offer her own. Instead, she crouched before the younger girl, noticing for the first time that the doll she clutched had one button eye missing and a tear at its shoulder seam. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand. The girl hesitated, eyes darting to her sister, who gave a small nod. Slowly she handed the doll over. The woman carried it to the window where the light was better, and took a small sewing kit from her satchel. She worked in silence, threading the needle with black thread, her fingers moving with a steady precision born from years of mending what couldn't be replaced. The girls watched from their chairs, leaning forward to see each stitch. By the time she knotted the thread and bit off the end, the doll's shoulder was whole again. She found a mismatched button in the tin of notions and sewed it where the missing eye had been, the pale circle giving the doll a new, slightly lopsided gaze. She placed it gently into the younger girl's arms, and the child hugged it to her chest without a word. The door creaked open then, letting in a blade of cold air. The tall man from the night before stood there, his hat pulled low, snow clinging to his shoulders. He carried a small burlap sack and another bundle of kindling. Without a greeting, he stepped inside, crossed to the stove, and added wood to the fire until the flames licked higher. The girls sat very still watching him. The woman kept her eyes on the movement of his hands, the way he worked without rush or waste. When he finished, he placed the sack on the table. "Dried apples," he said, his voice deep and unhurried. Then he straightened, adjusted his gloves, and gave a slight nod toward the girls before leaving again. The younger girl darted to the sack, peeking inside. She pulled out one of the leathery apple slices and sniffed it before taking a tentative bite. Her face softened in quiet pleasure. She passed one to her sister, who accepted it solemnly as though it were an offering. The woman didn't take any, not yet. Instead, she sat back down, watching the steam from the fire rise in soft ribbons. The memory of the man's eyes lingered, steady, unreadable, but not cold. She didn't know why his presence stayed with her after the door had closed. That afternoon, she ventured out with the girls, their shawls wrapped tight, boots crunching on the thin crust of snow. They walked to the mercantile to see if she could barter the small jar of preserves she still carried. Inside, the air was warmer but smelled faintly of kerosene and burlap. The shopkeeper, a man with a bristled mustache, looked up from his ledger, his gaze flicking from the woman to the girls and back again. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his tone polite but cool. She held up the jar. "Trade for flour if you've a mind." He studied it, then shrugged, taking it from her and placing a small sack of flour on the counter. As she thanked him, two women by the shelves paused in their conversation, their eyes lingering on the trio. One leaned toward the other and murmured something that drew a tight-lipped smile. The woman felt the heat of their scrutiny even as she gathered the flour and ushered the girls outside. The cold was almost welcome after the stifling closeness of the mercantile. They walked back in silence, though the older girl glanced up at her once, her brow furrowed as if she wanted to ask something but decided against it. Back at the boarding house, she set the flour on the counter and looked around the room. It was small, bare, but with the fire going and the quilt still warm from the girls' rest, it held a thin thread of comfort. She found herself reluctant to leave again. As evening settled in, she boiled a few of the potatoes the man had left the night before, their earthy smell filling the air. She mashed them with a fork, sprinkling in salt from a small paper twist she kept in her satchel. The girls ate with quiet focus, each bite slow and deliberate as if making it last. Afterward, the older girl helped gather the plates, standing on tiptoe to place them back on the shelf. The younger curled up near the stove, her doll tucked under her chin. The woman took the quilt and draped it around both girls, sitting down beside them. For a moment, none of them spoke. The firelight flickered over their faces, casting shadows that deepened the lines of weariness and softened the shapes of their eyes. The woman found herself tracing the edge of the younger girl's braid with her gaze, noticing the uneven strands, the way the hair caught the light like pale thread. "You can stay here tonight," she said finally, her voice low. The older one looked at her sharply as though testing the truth of it. "What about you?" She hesitated. "I'll be here too. For now." Something eased in the girl's posture and she settled back into the quilt. The woman didn't miss the way her shoulders lowered, as if shedding a weight too heavy for someone her size. Later, when the girls had drifted into sleep, the woman sat alone by the stove, staring into the embers. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. She thought of the man again, his quiet hands, his wordless gestures, and of the women in the mercantile, their eyes sharp as glass. Between those two images lay the narrow space she found herself in, noticed but not claimed, judged but not defended. She reached for her satchel, feeling the meager contents within. Coins enough for one more day's bread. A locket with a picture too faded to make out. The sewing kit. She wondered if the girls had anything at all beyond the shawls on their backs and the doll. The fire gave a low sigh, and she pulled the quilt higher around the children, watching their small chests rise and fall. She thought of how easily someone could walk in and take them, how quickly they could vanish into the cold, uncaring sprawl beyond the town. She told herself it wasn't her place to guard them. But she didn't move from her seat until the first pale streaks of dawn began to edge the sky. When the knock came at mid-morning, it startled all three of them. The woman rose, pulling the door open to find the tall man again, his breath clouding in the cold air. In his hands he held a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "For the girls," he said simply, handing it to her. Inside were 2 thick woolen blankets, rough but warm. She looked up, ready to thank him, but his gaze was fixed on the children behind her. The older girl gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. The younger just clutched her doll tighter. He stepped back, pulling his hat lower. "Snow's coming in heavy tonight. Keep the fire high." Then he was gone, his boots crunching over the snow, his figure soon swallowed by the bend in the street. The woman closed the door slowly, holding the blankets in her hands. The girls were watching her, their expressions unreadable. She set the blankets on the bed, smoothing the fabric as though it were something finer than wool. Outside, the first new flakes had begun to fall, spinning gently against the glass. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the snow were pressing in from all sides. She sat down beside the girls, pulling them close under one of the blankets. For a while they simply listened to the wind build, the fire snapping softly in the stove. But under the quiet, a thought was taking root, one she hadn't dared let grow before. It whispered of a choice that might come sooner than she wished, and of the fact that once it did, none of their lives would remain untouched. By morning, the storm had thinned to a pale sift of flakes drifting down in lazy spirals, catching in the seams of rooftops and the creases of boot tracks left from the night before. The street outside was quieter than usual, the few figures braving the cold wrapped in coats pulled high and scarves wound tight. The boarding house room smelled faintly of wood smoke and boiled potatoes, a ghost of last night's meal lingering in the air. The girls stirred slowly under their blankets, hair rumpled from sleep, the younger small hand still wrapped around the rag doll's leg as if even in dreams she feared losing it. The woman coaxed the fire back to life, its orange flicker casting restless shadows on the walls. She poured the last of the dried apples into a small tin pail and pressed it into the older girl's hands. "Eat some now. We'll take the rest with us." The girl blinked at her. "Where?" "Into town. We need flour and you two need boots that keep out snow." She glanced at the worn edges of their footwear, scuffed leather thin enough that cold could pass through like water through gauze. They bundled into their shawls, cheeks peeking out like pale coins. The older helped the younger with her fringe, wrapping it twice before tying it in a loose knot at her throat. Outside, the air was sharp and dry enough to sting the lungs. The woman kept the girls close as they stepped down from the boardwalk, her skirt hem sweeping the snow. The mercantile's bell jangled faintly as they entered, bringing with them a draft of cold that made the clerk look up from his ledger. His eyes flicked from her to the children, then back to his book. 2 women in heavy wool dresses were standing near the counter, their baskets half filled with coffee beans and soap. They both turned at the sound of the door. It was not the turning itself that carried weight but the pause, just long enough to measure and to judge. Their eyes settled on the trio, and in the narrow lift of one brow and the whisper passed between them, the woman felt the familiar prickle at the base of her neck. She kept her steps measured, moving toward the bins of flour at the far end. The girls trailed close, their eyes wide as they took in shelves lined with tins, bolts of cloth, jars of penny candy. She found a small sack and filled it, weighing it in her hands before setting it on the counter. "That'll be 12 cents, the clerk said without looking at her. She slid the coins across, hearing them clink sharper than usual in the silence. One of the women near the counter spoke, her voice pitched low but meant to carry. "It's a shame, children being dragged from place to place." Her companion answered in the same tone. "Worse still when the companies know better than it ought to be." The words were cold but not unfamiliar. The woman kept her face still, lifting the flour into her satchel without so much as a glance in their direction. Beside her the older girl stiffened. The younger looked from one face to another, confusion shadowing her features. "Come," the woman said softly, guiding them toward the door. They stepped back into the white glare of the street, the cold biting sharper after the closeness inside. For a moment they stood there in the muffled quiet, breath rising like pale smoke. A movement caught her eye across the way. The tall man from before was standing outside the feed store, a coil of rope in one hand. His gaze met hers briefly, then shifted to the girls. He didn't cross the street, didn't call out, only tipped his hat in a gesture that was neither hurried nor casual. She returned the nod almost without thinking, then turned to lead the girls back toward the boarding house. That afternoon he appeared again, this time on the boarding house porch. The sound of his boots on the planks was solid and unhurried. When she opened the door, he was carrying a small box of tools and a length of pine board. "Your shutter's loose," he said, glancing toward the side window where the wind had been rattling it for days. She stood aside. He set to work without further conversation, removing the broken hinge and cutting a new brace. The scent of fresh pine mingled with the faint tang of metal as he worked, the steady rasp of the plane filling the small space between them. The girls watched from the threshold, the younger holding her doll by one arm, the older resting her chin on the porch rail. When he finished, he tested the shutter, opening and closing it with a quiet satisfaction. She stepped forward. "Coffee?" He hesitated, then nodded once. She poured it into a tin mug, the steam curling upward. He drank standing, looking out toward the street as if the view were more familiar than the warmth in his hands. The younger girl padded over, holding the doll out toward him. "She's fixed now," she said, her voice small. He looked down at the doll, his expression unreadable, then took it gently, turning it once in his hands. "Good stitches," he murmured, glancing at the woman. Then he handed it back, his large fingers briefly brushing the girl's. When he left, he gave the same slight nod as before, but there was something steadier in it now, as though acknowledging not just the girls but her presence as part of them. By evening, word had traveled. The boarding house keeper stopped her on the way to fetch water, leaning against the doorway with an expression somewhere between curiosity and caution. "Folks v been talking. Saying you've been keeping company with that rancher out by the creek." The woman straightened. He fixed a shutter. "Brought some food for the children." The keeper shrugged. "I'm just telling you how it sounds to people who like to make things sound worse." The words lingered longer than they should have, even after she'd returned to the room. The girls were sitting near the stove, heads bent over a small scrap of paper where the older was showing the younger how to draw a house. The lines were crooked, the proportions impossible, but the door was wide and the windows bright. She watched them for a long moment, a heaviness settling in her chest. The warmth of the fire, the smell of pine from the repaired shutter, the quiet focus of the girls, it all felt temporary, a borrowed peace. After supper, she wrapped the younger in the new blanket the man had brought, tucking it under her chin. The older climbed into bed beside her sister, their feet tangling under the quilt. Outside, the wind rose again, whistling faintly through the gaps in the boards. She sat in the chair nearest the stove, her hands wrapped around a mug of water gone lukewarm. Her thoughts kept circling back to the mercantile, to the sidelong glances and the soft, cutting words. She'd heard them before in other towns wearing other faces. They were the kind of words that could spread faster than truth, leaving a mark harder to mend than torn cloth. A knock came just before the lamps were turned down. When she opened the door, the rancher stood there, a paper parcel in one hand. "Leftover biscuits from the housekeeper," he said, holding it out. She took them, the warmth of the paper seeping into her palms. "You didn't have to." His gaze shifted past her to the girls in bed. "I know." He stepped back into the cold, pulling his coat tight. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, but instead he tipped his hat and walked away, his boots leaving clean tracks in the thin snow. She closed the door and leaned against it, the biscuit still warm in her hands. The girls stirred in their sleep, one murmuring something unintelligible. She crossed to the table, setting the parcel down, and listened to the wind push against the newly fixed shutter. The room felt different now, not less safe but edged with the knowledge that safety was never something given freely in towns like this. It was noticed, weighed, and often taken apart by eyes that never looked directly at you. She glanced once more at the girls, then at the door where his footprints had been before the snow began to blur them. Somewhere out there, words were being spoken about her, shaping the air she'd have to walk through in the days to come. And yet, beneath the murmur of judgment, there was something else, quieter but no less certain, waiting to decide whether she'd stand her ground or slip away before the weight became too much. The frost came harder in the night, glazing the window panes until the light of morning broke through in fractured patterns. The air in the room was brittle, each breath visible before the stove gave in to its slow, dying sigh. She rose quietly, feeding it the last of the kindling he'd brought days ago, but the fire only shuddered back to life in weak, reluctant flames. The girls were still asleep, curled into each other beneath the blankets, the younger's doll cradled between them like a third sibling. Their cheeks were pink from the cold, their lips parted in shallow breaths. She stood for a long moment just watching, committing the sight to memory in a way she didn't want to name. By midday the sky had lowered to the color of pewter. The wind prowled through the cracks in the boards, bringing with it a faint hiss of snow sweeping across the street. Supplies were nearly gone, flour at the bottom of the sack, a few potatoes softening in the corner bin. She thought of the biscuits he had brought, now reduced to crumbs in a tin, and the awkward gratitude she had felt then. Word in town had grown sharper. That morning as she filled the pail at the pump, the two women from the mercantile passed by. They didn't stop, but their conversation bent deliberately toward her ears. "Pity is one thing," one said. "But pity can be bought dear when a man forgets his own reputation." The other gave a thin laugh. They didn't look back. She carried the water inside and set it by the stove. The older girl watched her, brow creased. "Are they talking about us?" Her throat tightened. "They're talking about me." The girl seemed to think on this, then said, "We don't care what they say." But the woman did. Not because the words themselves carried truth, but because she knew what they could build into, whispers becoming suspicion, suspicion becoming reason enough for someone to decide she didn't belong here. And if they sent her away, the girls would be left to the same cold wind she had been walking in before she found them. That night the rancher came again. He didn't step inside, just left a sack of coal by the door. "Snow'll be heavier by morning," he said. His gaze lingered on her, searching for something she wasn't ready to give. She thanked him quietly, but it felt like the words caught on a stone in her chest. After he left, she sat in the chair near the stove, staring at the coal. She thought of what the keeper had said, what the women in town had let slip, and felt the old pull of flight, the instinct to slip away before someone could decide her fate for her. It had kept her alive this long, that leaving before being left. The girls played at her feet, arranging buttons from her sewing kit into crooked lines on the floorboards. Every so often the younger would look up as if to check she was still there. The sight made something inside her ache in a way that felt both protective and dangerous. When the room was finally quiet, she fetched the girls' shawls and laid them over the backs of the chairs, smoothing the fringe with deliberate care. She mended a small tear in the older's hem. Her hands worked by habit, but her mind was already on the road, the cold bite of air, the way the horizon swallowed you once you stepped beyond the town's last fence. In the small hours before dawn she rose. The stove was down to embers, the air biting. She dressed silently, layering what clothes she had, tucking her sewing kit into her satchel. The girls lay tangled together, their breath soft, the quilt drawn up to their ears. She reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from the older's face. The girl stirred but didn't wake. She took the rag doll from where it lay between them. With a scrap of ribbon from her pocket, she tied it carefully around the doll's waist, the knot small and tight. She set it back exactly as it had been, her fingers lingering for a heartbeat on the worn cloth. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she crossed to the door. She eased it open, the cold rushing in to meet her. Outside, the street was a pale, unbroken sheet. Her boots crunched in the fresh snow, each step swallowed quickly by the wind. She didn't look back until she reached the corner. The boarding house stood quiet, its windows dark, the repaired shutter holding firm against the gusts. For a moment she almost turned around. But the thought of staying, of letting the gossip root deeper, of risking the girls being pulled into whatever judgment fell on her, pushed her onward. The wind cut hard against her face as she stepped into the open stretch beyond the last row of buildings. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, the world narrowing to white. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking, her figure soon swallowed by the storm. At the boarding house, the door rattled faintly in the wind. It was the sound that woke the older girl. She blinked into the gray light, her eyes finding the empty chair by the stove, the shawls folded on the backs of chairs, the ribbon now tied around the doll's waist. She sat up slowly, clutching the doll, and turned toward the door just as heavy footsteps crossed the porch. The latch lifted. The rancher stepped inside, the cold curling in around him. He looked from the bed to the empty chair, then back to the girls. His jaw tightened, and without a word, he set the coal by the stove. The younger stirred, rubbing her eyes. "She's gone," the older said, her voice small but certain. He stood there for a long moment, the wind pressing at his back, before closing the door against it. The storm did not let go quickly. For 2 days, the wind scoured the land, dragging curtains of snow across the fields until the horizon vanished. The rancher kept the girls close, his cabin warmer than the boarding house had ever been. He fed the fire high, split kindling until his shoulders ached, boiled potatoes and bacon until the air was thick with heat and salt. The girls stayed near the stove, their shawls drying on the backs of chairs, their bare feet wrapped in wool socks far too big for them. At night, they slept in his bed under layers of quilts, while he took the rocker by the hearth, listening to the roof creak under the weight of snow. They spoke little, but the questions came in fragments. "Will she be back?" from the younger, whispered into the dark. The older never asked, but he saw the way she sat at the window during daylight, staring toward the road, her rag doll on her lap, the ribbon tied around its waist as bright as a promise. He didn't answer the question aloud. Not yet. On the third morning the snow eased. The air was still sharp enough to bite, but the sky had broken open into a pale, thin blue. He saddled his horse and told the girls to stay inside, the latch pulled tight. Their eyes followed him as he stepped out, the sound of hooves muffled in the deep white. He found her on the far side of town, in the leaning shadow of a hay shed. She was sitting on a low beam, her skirts stiff with frost, her satchel at her feet. Her eyes lifted at the sound of his approach, though she didn't stand. Snow clung to the strands of hair that had slipped loose, and her cheeks were raw from the cold. "You're hard to find," he said, voice low but carrying. "I didn't mean to be found." Her tone was even, but there was a weariness in it, like the last ember in a fire. He dismounted, the snow crunching under his boots. "They've been waiting. Both of them. Won't say much to me, but they keep the window fogged from looking out." Her gaze faltered, just enough for him to see the fracture. "It's better if I go. They'll be safer without my name in their mouths." "Whose mouths?" "Everyone's." She looked past him toward the road, as if the wind there might carry her somewhere nameless. "You know what they're saying." "I know talk dies quicker when you give it nothing to feed on," he said. "And I know those girls don't care what a single one of them says. They care who's there when the fire goes low and the dark comes in." Her hands tightened in her lap. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to be that person." "Then maybe this is where you learn." Silence sat between them, heavy as the snow on the roofs. He stepped closer, enough that the heat from his coat reached her. "We don't need fixing. Just a place to belong. All of us." She looked at him then, and he saw the walls she'd carried, thin but stubborn, start to buckle. The wind picked up, rattling the shed's loose boards. He held out his hand. "Come home." Her fingers hesitated only a moment before they slid into his, cold and trembling. He helped her to her feet, slung her satchel over his shoulder, and led her to the horse. She mounted behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, the contact tentative at first, then steadier as the horse pushed through the snow. When the cabin came into view, two small shapes were pressed against the window. By the time he swung down and lifted her to the ground, the door had flown open. The girls ran across the yard, boots kicking up snow, voices breaking into laughter that carried like bells in the cold air. The younger reached her first, clutching at her skirts with mittened hands, the doll pressed against her hip. The older stood back half a pace, her eyes searching the woman's face. When she found what she was looking for, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her waist. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and broth. He set her satchel down by the hearth, where the fire was burning high. At the table, a third place was already set, a bowl, a cup, a chair pulled out. She stood there, looking at it, her fingers brushing the back of the chair as though afraid it might vanish if she claimed it. He watched her take the seat, the girls crowding in on either side. She reached for the bread without thinking, tore it into thirds, and passed pieces to them before taking her own. When her gaze lifted to his, it held something quieter than relief, deeper than thanks. Outside, the snow began to fall again, softer now, the kind that blankets the world without erasing what's beneath. The girls ate quickly, crumbs catching on their mittens, their laughter spilling into the small room. He poured coffee into her cup, draped his coat across the back of her chair, and for the first time in a long while, the air inside felt untouched by the cold. Later, when the bowls were empty and the girls had drifted to the hearth, she sat back, her hands folded around the warm cup. Her shoulders had eased into the shape of someone no longer braced to leave. He saw it, and she must have known he did because she didn't look away. In that quiet, with the fire snapping and the wind moving gently against the walls, it became clear to them both. The winter might be long, the town might talk, but here, at this table, with these hands, with these small, certain hearts, was the place they had chosen. And this time no one was walking away.